Welcome back to the channel. My name is Lisa Elvin Stoltare, and I'm a genealogist and a passionate traveler. Over the last few years, I've been featuring Les Filles du Roi, the King's Daughters, and getting to know their stories a little bit better. This is my latest series, Les Filles Mariées, the marriageable girls. These are the women who came before. Their stories are magnificent. So I'm glad you're here with me today to explore the life of one of the marriageable girls. But before we begin, let me show you ways you can support the channel. The first three keep you in the know. Subscribe, like, and notify. All of that helps my logarithms and really helps the channel continue to gain traction. And then the next ways are ways to help the channel grow. We have coffee, which is a one-time donation of any amount you would like. We have Patreon, which you can subscribe to my channel, and there are different levels. And then we also have a super thanks where you can do a super thanks on this actual video. Just click on that and determine. And you can also go on my website and do a PayPal donation as well. All of that helps me out. Thank you to those of you who have donated thus far. Really appreciate your support. So let's get started and get to know our filles mariées of this episode. Mariées were ladies who came between 1634 and 1662. These are very specific dates. 1634 is when Quebec was given back to France, and this is when the true settlement of Quebec began, even although it had been a colony since 1608. 1662 is the year before Les Filles du Roi began emerging. In fact, there are some filles mariées who are, still considered filles mariées, and they were married in early 1663, but that's getting into the weeds. So these are amazing women because they didn't come with groups of women like the filles du Roi. They came alone or with a few other ladies. They were generally sponsored by a church or someone from the village that they were from. They were definitely brave and courageous. Certainly the ones that came between 1634 and 1644 are amazing. Every time I get to do one of those, it's just amazing to me that they came at all. So if the Filles du Roi are the founding mothers of Quebec, these, my friends, les filles mariées, are the founding grandmothers. So if this is your ancestry, you definitely need to explore it and uncover how these ladies are truly the backbone of Quebec and the growth of New France. This is episode 32, Francoise Capel. This is a viewer request. In fact, a few viewers. And when I started reading about this lady, oh my gosh, I needed to do her immediately. She was one that I worked on during my recent trip to Quebec. And I just kept going, what? She did what? I also regular viewers will note that the illustration for the Filles Mariées is different, and that is through my dearest best friend. She has started her own graphic design, and it's called Julie Freedom Designs, and I've posted the information. So she actually designed this for us. So I love what she's doing, and you'll see more of her work as we progress. So let's get to know Francoise a little bit better. So she was born 1627 in Cesny-sur-Vigne in France. And you can imagine that it's Cesny-sur-Vigne means on the vines. So obviously there was some wine, production in there. And you can see by the circle that it is from the Normandy region of France. And she is from the département of Orne. Now, Cesny-sur-Vigne actually became, in 1972, it was amalgamated with another town, Uzy, but by 2006, the people of Cesny-sur-Vigne just said, or I guess the two different towns said, no, we want a divorce. So now it's back to being Cesny-sur-Vigne, which I think is charming. It's a small community. There's about 416 people living there, and that's an aerial view of the little village. So I just think that's wonderful. So that is where our fille mariée came from. When did she arrive? So Francoise would come to New France most probably in September of 1650 with a ship that was led by the famous Jeanne Mance. Jeanne Mance was one of the founders of New France and Montreal. She and Paul de Maisonneuve were instrumental in establishing Montreal. Francoise would actually disembark at Quebec City and would join the Ursuline convent, where she was focused on becoming a nun. So Francoise would enter the convent and would take the name Sister Saint Michel. On December 30th, 1650, the convent would suffer a great fire that actually eventually was ruled accidental. The accident seemed to have started in the kitchen and was attributed to a novice nun who had forgotten to put out the kitchen fire. Now, there is talk that it was our dear Francoise who had forgotten to put the kitchen fire out. She would leave the convent a few months later, going to stay with Eleanor Grandmaison in Ile d'Orléans. So, although it's coincidental, but that is the lore that she was actually, so obviously she did not become a nun. The groom that she would select and who would select her, his name, Jean Turcotte. We do not know the year he was born, but we know that he was born in Fontenay-le-Comte in France. His parents were François Turcotte and Joseph Punadeau. He is, and you can see in the circled map, Pays de la Loire is the region, Vendée is the department. And this area dates back to the Gauls, and during its history, it was captured and recaptured by the French and English alike. The picture of this castle tells the story of this amazing area. It is called Château de la Terre Neuve, which means Castle of the New Land, and dates to the late 15th century. It is actually open to the public. Would you love to go? He was most likely baptized at the church Notre Dame in Fontenay-le-Comte. So how did he come to New France? We believe that Jean would come to New France as early as August of 1647 because we have some documents that list him there. So we know he may have arrived earlier, but the odds are he was there certainly by 1647. So he may have come as a engagé, and signed a 3-year contract. Certainly he would have had to fulfill that contract before he was free to marry. So a contract was drawn 25th of April, 1651. The marriage would take place sometime in May of 1651. We do not have any kind of contract or marriage record that I've been able to find, but we know that this is when they would have been married. So she had arrived in 1650, the fire, all of that. So by May of 1651, she was ready to get married, and Jean obviously was free to do so. So they would settle in Trois-Rivières. It is only the second settlement of New France. Remember, I talked about 1634 being an important date? Well, that's when they established Trois-Rivières on July 4th of all times. And it was named Trois-Rivières, or in English, Three Rivers, because the St. Maurice River has 3 channels that form at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Trois-Rivières is obviously, French. It's a French word, but when I was growing up, we called it Three Rivers. The English, it was anglicized, as we would say in Quebec. As the French took over back their province and ultimately had linguistic demands, we began to call it Trois-Rivières, to the point that now Three Rivers sounds really strange to us. So Trois-Rivières is what it is known as. And it was a very strategic location on the St. Lawrence River, helping the new nation to grow and prosper. It also proved to be an important battle in the American Revolution. Here it is called the Battle of the Three Rivers. Some of you may have ancestors in this area who, you might be surprised, would have fought on the les Américains side and will qualify for admission to the daughters or sons of the American Revolution. Just amazing. I did a program on that. You might want to look up on one of my videos and see about becoming the French Canadian part of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Check that out if you suspect you might have one. So they would begin their family. They would have a son named Jacques, who was born in 1652, just after they got married, and he would go on to marry Anne Desrosiers and would have 8 children, all of whom would make it. Unfortunately, Jacques would be the only Turcotte heir because ultimately Jean was captured, tortured, and killed by the Iroquois on August 18, 1652. Francoise would give birth to Jacques 4 months after her husband died. Just a tragic, tragic event. So they were married maybe less than a year and a half. For those of you who have the lineage of Jean Turcotte, here is the information from our French-Canadian ancestors, tremendous little bio, and I've posted the information, what book it's in, and the pages, and our Free French-Canadian Ancestors is a wonderful website, not a website, I'm sorry, a Facebook page. Go on there, click on files, and you'll be able to read because they've downloaded all the profiles. So you'll be able to actually read that profile. So it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. One of the things about genealogies, we always want to make sure that the spelling or the actual name is actually our name. So the Turcotte name would be changed a little bit. So let me show you. This is from our Free French Canadian Ancestors. Circo, Turcotte, Turcot, Dumas, Dutot, Turcot, Turcotte with 2 T's, and Villandré. Now, a lot of those have to do with the D names that they would add to, and sometimes there's just a misspelling, or if they would come to America or another country and they would end up spelling it differently. So, and just the pronunciation. So that's important for you to always be on the lookout for those names, because sometimes you're like, I can't find this person. Well, it's because the name was so changed that it's impossible, not impossible, but it's going to take a little bit of scratching to find out the origin. So what was Francoise to do? Here she had a small child and she was all alone in a foreign country. Well, there's always another husband. And here was her second groom. His name was Jacques Lucas de Lepine, and he was born in Port-à-Bassin in France. His parents were Martin Lucas and René Hébert. You can see by the map that he was from the Normandy region. And he was from the Calvados department. Port-à-Bassin is, it contains the 2 towns of Port-en-Bessin and Hupin. Port-en-Bessin, just so you know, was on June 7, 1944, when the Allied forces and America met here. This is the actual monument to that. So after D-Day, June 6th, this is the place. Can you imagine? So, and this is a beautiful, picture of the town and also the church at Port-en-Bessin that possibly Jacques, I don't have confirmation of that, but that Jacques would have been baptized in. So remember that her first husband, Jean, was killed in 1652. A year and a bit later, she married at Three Rivers, November 9th, 1653, to her second husband. They would settle down in Cap de la Madeleine, and Cap de la Madeleine is just a little bit north of Trois-Rivières, and it was founded on March 20th, 1651. It was named by Jacques de la Ferté, who was the abbot of Sainte-Madeleine de Châteaudun in France. The city is famous for its basilica that you see on that screen, Basilica Notre-Dame du Cap, dedicated to Our Lady of the Cape. The basilica receives thousands of pilgrims and visitors each year. And it is the place where 2 miracles were performed by the Blessed Virgin Mary in 1879 and 1888. So they began, the first official pilgrimage occurred in 1883. Can you imagine? And by now, millions of people have made this trek. And you can see, I always like to include the picture of the shoreline because you can imagine this is what Jacques and Francoise would have seen. This is fairly untouched. So it's a beautiful part of Quebec. So they would go on to have 2 children. Marie would marry Louis Fafard and would have 6 children, 3 of whom made it to adulthood. Francoise would marry Marie-Madeleine Baudouin and have 2 children, both of whom made it to adulthood before his own early death at 41. Marie-Madeleine's mother was Marie Raclot, part of the 3 sisters who came as Filles du Roi, and who we featured in episode 52 of the Filles du Roi series. So have a look at that if that is your descendancy. It's almost unbelievable to occur, but she had a second child. Francois was born, and shortly thereafter, Jacques, her second husband, was killed by Iroquois on September 12th, 1659. When I read this, I was just like, oh my gosh. So what does she do? But before we move on, let's make sure if this is your descendancy, Jacques Lucas de Lespine, it's in our Free French Canadian Ancestors. It's in the volume number 17. And so have a look at that. You can access it on our Free French Canadian Ancestors. It will really give you a good story about Jacques if this is your descendancy. As always, we want to make sure that we discuss what are the names. So Lucas de Lespine, let's make sure that you can identify possibly people that might relate. So we have Lucas is Bayonnette, Bergerac, de Maubuisson, Donny, Francard, Lagarde, La Violette, Lepine, Lépine, Loiseau, Marbution, Renaud, Saint-Jacques, and Saint-Venant. So that's from the Lucas side. Lespine, Chabotier, Chaillet, Chabaudier, Chavaudière, Chavoyer, Fer, and Lepine. So, oh my gosh, right? So have a look at your tree and see if there's anybody named in that. And that is also from our Free French Canadian Ancestors, volume 20, I've got it wrong, volume 17. So after the tragic deaths of 2 of her husbands, she would then select a third. His name was Jacques Marchand, or Le Marchand. He was born in 1637 in Caen, in Normandy region, and he was part of the Calvados department. His parents are unknown. It's the 3rd largest city in Normandy with about 105,000 people. It's existed since the Roman time and originally had the name Cateau-Maugus, which is Gaulish in origin meaning field, and Cateau means combat. It remained relatively small until the 10th century when William the Conqueror constructed the Château de Caen. Over the next few hundred years, Caen would go back and forth between France and England. I was not able to confirm where Jacques was baptized. So Jacques would come to Canada in 1656 as an 18-year-old engagé. He would sign a 3-year contract. So Françoise and Jacques, her third husband, would be married at Trois-Rivières on February 1st, 1660. This would mark for Françoise yet another marriage and another move. Let's have a look at what her life is about, how her life is about to change. In my research, I found something very interesting. Remember, they were married in 1660, but they were living at Cap de la Madeleine, and the land that she had is actually listed. And then I wanted to blow it up so you would see Veuve de Turcotte et de Lucas. So that is the widow of Turcotte and Lucas. She owned that land. Talk about a woman of substance, right? So her third husband, obviously came into the marriage knowing that she owned land. And she was I would think, not a well-to-do, but certainly was comfortable widow and had been left land. So the family would ultimately settle at Betska, where we find them in the censuses that would occur later on. And the history of Betska begins with our old friend Champlain, who met up with a native named Batsquan in 1609, and by 1612, Champlain had named this area Batsquan. In 1636, the seigneurie was granted to Jacques Laferté, at which time it was called Madeleine. By 1639, it was divided up and given to the Jesuits. Hence, the area did not grow until 1666, when settlers began to arrive. This is presumably when Francoise and Jacques would arrive. Prior to 1670, the inhabitants met at the home of Lieutenant Nicolas Rivard de Levigne in a wooden chapel. Is finally constructed in 1684 when the parish of Saint Francois Xavier de Batisca is formed. And just FYI, Nicolas Rivard is my great grandfather. So and is the great grandfather of many of my viewers. And so it's really neat to know that Jacques Le Marchand and Françoise would obviously have known Nicolas as well. So kind of, touching upon history. There were so many census for this family that I really wanted to zero in on it. So we have the 1666 census where we have Jacques and Françoise. Remember, she's 10 years older than him. So we have Jacques Turcotte living there. Fils du premier lit. Literally translated, that means son of the first bed. Then we have Marie Lucas and François Lucas, fille and fils du second, of the second bed. And then we have Marie Magdalene de Marchand, who's 4 years old, Françoise de Marchand, and Marguerite, 2 months. They actually have a domestic helping them. And then in 1677, we have Jacques Le Marchand with Françoise, and then we have Jacques, her first son, and Marie and François from her second husband, and then we have Marie Madeleine, Marie Françoise, Marguerite, and then we have Jean Langlois again. He's now somehow gotten 25 years younger, and it lists that they have 8 beasts or 8 cattle, and they own 16 arpents valants. So I would assume that was, and I don't know this to be true. This would have been Françoise's land. She would have sold land, possibly at Cap de la Madeleine, and then bought Batisca. And then we have 1681, the census Batisca, Jacques Marchand, Françoise Capel. Their children, Jacques, Marie, François, Madeleine, Françoise, Alexis. 3 guns, 6 goats, and 30 arpents valants. So they grew from 16 to 30 in about 14 years. So let us have a look at the family that Jacques and Françoise built. So they would go on to have 4 children. Marie Madeleine would marry Jean Maillot and have 2 children, both of whom would make it to adulthood. Later in her life, she would marry Sir René Lagardère, the son of Charles Lagardère, the governor of Trois-Rivières. Françoise would also marry well. She married Jean-François Fafard, de La Framboise, who specialized in fur. At his death, according to sources, he left Françoise the largest fortune of that time, which was 40,000 pounds. They would have 5 children, 3 of whom would make it to adulthood. Marguerite would not make it past the 1681 census. Alexis would marry first Marie-Catherine Rivard, whose mother was fille à mariée Catherine Saint-Père, who we featured in episode 1, I'm sorry, and would have 2 children, both of whom would make it. He would then marry Jeanne Tatar and have 2 children, both of whom would make it as well. Jacques would die October 6, 1695, at age 67. Jacques and Françoise would have been married 36 years. That third marriage finally took. Françoise would outlive him by just 4 years, dying herself at age 73 on April 19, 1699. She had been living with her daughter-in-law at Champlain and was buried there in that cemetery. She would have, in total, with her 3 husbands, 163 descendants as of the 1729 study that they did. Just amazing. Jacques Le Marchand also has a profile in our French-Canadian ancestors. He's featured in volume 4, and I've posted the links for you to have a look. Also, remember, you can go and read the entire profile at our Free French-Canadian Ancestors. Have a look at that. If you can get your hands on these books, that's even better. They're very hard to find. There are a few variations of Le Marchand, which include, of course, Marchand, Delignerie, Desavigny, and Delignerie. These are obviously the names that were attached, and that is from page 179 in our Free French Canadian Ancestors. And these are all of the resources that I love to feature. Some of them are, societies that you can join. Certainly the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan is one of the best in terms of dealing with, especially if you have Detroit and Michigan ancestry. Obviously, the American French Genealogical Society has been going forever. 1978. The American Canadian Genealogical Society is another great one. And the Quebec Family History Society, based in Quebec, is one to look at as well. So have a look at that. All of those resources I have put down in the notes if you want to continue your studies. What can I say about Francoise Capel? What a woman. 3 marriages, 163 descendants. She just kept going. And yeah, lest we forget the whole, becoming a nun, possibly burning down the convent. Just an amazing, amazing life. She didn't live like till 80 or 90, but boy, she packed a lot in that life. I wish I was one of her descendants. I think she would, be amazing. And I salute those of you who have her as a great grandmother, because obviously you come from amazing, amazing stock. So we want to thank Francoise for her incredible contribution to New France, for marrying 3 times and not giving up, and producing. She actually had, 7 children in all. And so that is a feat unto itself. And most of her children did live to adulthood and did produce descendants, which is another great thing. But to have lived in that particular part of Quebec during that time with the Indian threats obviously required a very brave soul. I guess she could have just turned around and gone back to France. I don't know. But she chose to persevere. And for that, we are grateful. And we bless her memory and are thankful that she came to our shores. And I am also thankful for my patrons and supporters. You keep me going. Thank you for being there, and for your notes and your comments and all of that. Appreciate all that you do. So with that being said, I will see you on the next episode of Les Filles à Marier. Until then, au revoir.